Right, so picture this. It's the late Bronze Age, like around 1250 BC, give or take, and nestled in what's now northern Germany, the Tollense Valley, this place, about to become, well, a battleground, unlike any other we've ever seen.
Yeah, I secured very
We're
much.
talking thousands of warriors.
Yeah.
This level of conflict, practically unheard of in this period. And talk about a mystery, right? Archaeologists are still trying to put the pieces together.
And that's the thing. Unlike most stuff from that long ago, this battle, it left some pretty compelling clues behind, physically.
Yeah.
The amount of weapons they found, skeletal remains, especially for that time and place, I mean, it points to something truly, truly huge.
Okay, so we've got a battlefield frozen in time.
Yeah.
And lucky for us, one of the things our crack team of researchers found, get this, arrowheads, over 60 of them. And these things are like little time capsules.
Mm-hmm.
We can learn who these warriors were, where they came from.
Absolutely. It's fascinating, the mix of arrowheads we're dealing with here. You see, you'd expect in this region, flint arrowheads. Those were like the standard in Northern Europe during the Bronze Age. We see plenty of those. But then, well, that's when things get even more interesting.
Because mixed in with the local stuff, the flint, they pulled out a bunch of bronze arrowheads.
Right.
Which, and maybe it's just me, but that wasn't exactly typical for this area, was it?
No, not at all. So while bronze arrowheads, yeah, they were becoming more common, in other parts of Europe, especially if you go south. Places like Bavaria, finding them in the Tollense Valley, like with these numbers, that suggests at least one of these groups, these fighters, they weren't your average local warriors. They were from somewhere else, and these guys, they came prepared for a serious fight.
It's like, it's not even just the material, right? It's the type of bronze that really deepens the mystery.
Oh, 100%. Think of it like this. These bronze arrowheads, they weren't all created equal. Some were way more common depending on the region. Like, for example, the researchers, they found these very specific barbed bronze arrowheads. And get this, these things, they've only ever been found at a tiny handful of sites, and most of those clustered in southern Germany.
Wow. So it's like, what? Like finding a fingerprint at a crime scene, only instead of a person, it's a whole group of warriors who traveled, hundreds of miles to get to this battlefield.
Yeah.
Someone called the history detectives, right?
It's true. It really does suggest this wasn't just some local territory squabble. Something much bigger, something way more organized was going down here. And honestly, the deeper we dig, the weirder it gets.
Oh, I do love a good mystery. What other goodies did they find at the scene of the, battle?
Okay, so besides all the arrowheads, right, the team also dug up a whole bunch of other artifacts at Tollense, and they just reinforced this idea that somebody was coming up from the south. So there's this particular type of sword, and it's, mainly associated with southern Germany, along with gold spiral rings, and again, much more common down south, even dress pins, very distinct southern styles.
It's wild. After all this time, these little things, they can tell us so much. It's like holding a piece of the past right in your hand. But get this, it gets even wilder, because where they found this stuff within the Tollense Valley adds like another layer to this whole puzzle.
Oh, yeah, you're right. The way these arrowhead types are spread out, it's not random. There's a pattern, and it's got archaeologists wondering, get this, if maybe, just maybe, what they've stumbled on is the actual progression of the battle itself.
Hold on. So we're talking about mapping out troop movements from, over 3,000 years ago?
Yeah.
Like where the armies were, maybe even flanking maneuvers, all based on where these little arrowheads were found. That's some next-level detective work.
It really is. It's incredible what they can deduce. So, for example, down by the river, closer to what looks like the main battle site, there's a high concentration of those locally made flint arrowheads.
Right.
And those more common northern bronze ones, too.
So maybe like a clash the front lines, local defenders holding their ground.
Could be. But then you go further upstream, and the terrain narrows, creates this kind of choke point.
Okay.
And that's where the arrowheads change. That's where we see way more of those rare southern types.
So they were like trying to hold the line, stop reinforcements from getting to the main battle. Man, I'm getting chills just thinking about it. But this all begs the question, what were they fighting over? Like, was it land, resources, or was there something more going on here?
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The arrowheads, they do a great job, painting this picture of who and how, but the why, that's the part we're still trying to figure out. We can guess. One thing's for sure, the Bronze Age, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows.
Yeah, for real. I mean, when I think Bronze Age, I think like those statues, The kind of goofy-looking ones, not necessarily like all-out war.
Well, it was definitely a time of huge innovation. I mean, hence the bronze, right?
Right.
But also a ton of change, upheaval even. Populations were booming, competition for resources, it was fierce. Plus new technologies popping up left and right. And trade routes, forget it, they were expanding like crazy, connecting cultures in ways that honestly they'd never seen before.
So it's like this pressure cooker situation. You've got all these different groups, all with their own thing going on, their own customs, their own beliefs, and maybe most importantly, their own needs. And they're all fighting for a piece of the pie. Sounds like a recipe for, well, disaster.
Exactly. And we may never know what exactly set off the whole Tollense Valley thing, but the research, it does give us some interesting possibilities. Fertile land, for example, that was like prime real estate back then. And if you could control a good trade route, man, that could make or break you.
Right. Or what if, like, somebody got their hands on some awesome tin, because you need that for bronze.
Oh, yeah.
Word gets out, and suddenly everyone wants the best weapons, right?
Of course.
But you mentioned earlier that it might not have been just like practical stuff, like land and resources.
It's true. We can't rule out the whole social, cultural side of things. These weren't just random groups, faceless, nameless. They were real people with their own identities, their own alliances, and, yeah, probably some grudges too.
Okay, so hold on. We're talking power struggles, family drama, Bronze Age style, maybe even some good old-fashioned revenge. Man, if only those arrowheads could talk.
Right. Unfortunately, no written records from back then, so those motivations, they stay nice and mysterious.
So fascinating.
Yeah.
But so frustrating at the same time. We can pinpoint, like, down to the mile, where these guys came from, what weapons they used, even how the battle might have played out. But why they did it, what they were thinking. We may never know for sure.
That's archaeology for you, always piecing together these little bits and pieces. But some stories, well, they just might stay untold. Doesn't mean we can't still learn from them, though.
Okay, so even with all these unanswered questions, what can we learn from this battle? From Tollense Valley? Like, how does this change the way we think about this period, this turning point in European history?
Well, for one, it makes us rethink just how big, how complex violence was back then. This wasn't a bunch of tribes, scattered around fighting over hunting grounds.
Right.
Tollense, the sheer number of fighters, the fact that they traveled so far, those sophisticated weapons, that takes organization, serious logistics, strategic thinking that, honestly, we didn't used to think they had back then.
It really flips the script on that whole simpler times idea, doesn't it? Like, we tend to think of those massive battles happening later on, right?
Yeah.
Like Roman times or the Middle Ages.
Exactly. But Tollense, it's telling us that warfare, even back then, it wasn't just some chaotic mess. These were organized groups, maybe even armies, with plans, and tactics.
Wow. And, I mean, if it was happening in the Tollense Valley, who's to say it wasn't happening other places, too? It really makes you think differently about the Bronze Age. All the complexities. But what about the human cost of all this? We talk about thousands of warriors, but those are people, individuals with families, with lives. And, it's one thing to talk about, armies and battle strategy. But thankfully, the research didn't just stop with the arrowheads and all the cool stuff they dug up. The team, they really wanted to understand, like, the human toll of all this. So they took a close look at the skeletal remains. And I'll be honest, it's kind of rough.
Yeah, it's, not for the faint of heart. We're talking like skull fractures, parry wounds on arm bones. They even found arrowheads still stuck in the skeletons.
Oh, wow.
These weren't just, little cuts and scrapes. This was brutal, close-up, often fatal stuff.
It's hard to wrap your head around,
Yeah.
Like, that was somebody's reality. To actually be there experiencing that level of violence.
It really makes you think about war in a different way, even back then, right? Like, how brutal it really was. But as awful as it is to think about all those details, that's how we learn. It tells us a lot about how the battle went down, how just ferocious the fighting was.
It's like those crime shows.
Yeah.
Where they analyze blood spatter and all that. Except, Bronze Age battlefield edition.
Yeah.
So what can those injuries tell us, like, specifically?
Well, for one, the types of injuries, like those parry wounds on the forearms, huge clue. That tells us that hand-to-hand combat, it wasn't just a side thing. It was a big part of this battle. These weren't just armies hanging back, shooting arrows from a distance. This was up close and personal. Brutal.
Okay, so let's recap. We've got long-distance travelers, a whole mishmash of weapons, a good dose of mystery, and a whole lot of, well, violence. So big picture, what makes the Battle of Tollense Valley so important? Why does this one, out of all the battles, why does this one matter?
Because it's not just some random fight that happened thousands of years ago. This is a peek into a really crucial moment in European history. We're not just seeing armies clash, we're seeing cultures collide, technologies, ideas. This one encounter. It probably caused ripples all across the region, shaped everything from where the borders were to how bronze making spread, maybe even cultural practices, who knows?
It's like you almost wonder, right, if this clash, as horrible as it was, if it accidentally made way for new things, new ways of life, almost like a forced cultural exchange program. Except with, a lot more bloodshed.
It's definitely possible. And listen, we've learned a ton from the Tollense Valley site, but let's be real. This is just the tip of the iceberg.
There's so much more to discover, which I guess what makes archaeology so cool. And that's our show for today. We'll leave you to ponder the mysteries of the Tollense Valley battle. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and never stop digging deeper into the stories that have shaped our world.